one Kristin Rossum.
A murder case with Hollywood overtones, including a poisoned husband, a staged death scene, and a beautiful woman being sentenced to prison for life. It may be returning to a San Diego courtroom.
Kristin Rossum looked like everything a success story should be. She was smart, polished, and ambitious. A rising star at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's office, where she worked as a toxicologist. Her husband, Greg DeVillers, adored her. They lived in a bright, upscale apartment, had secure careers, and seemed to be building a beautiful life together. But behind that picture-perfect image was a toxic secret. One laced with drugs, infidelity, and a plan so cold it shocked even hardened detectives. Kristin had relapsed into methamphetamine use, a drug she'd struggled with in her past. She was also having an affair with her supervisor, Dr. Michael Robertson, the very person responsible for overseeing drug testing in her department. When Greg discovered both secrets, he confronted her. He wasn't just angry. He was planning to report the affair and her drug use to her employer. A move that would have destroyed Kristin's career and reputation. That threat, prosecutors say, is what pushed her to do the unthinkable. On November 6, 2000, Kristin made a dramatic 911 call. Her husband, she claimed, had taken his own life. When paramedics arrived, they found Greg's body on their bed, still, pale, and surrounded by something strange. Dozens of red rose petals were carefully scattered across the sheets and floor. It was a chilling scene, not because of what was there, but because it all looked too deliberate, too staged. Investigators' instincts kicked in immediately. At first, Kristin played the role of devastated widow. She cried. She explained that Greg had been depressed, that maybe he'd overdosed, but the autopsy didn't support that story. Greg had never shown signs of suicidal ideation. What the toxicology report did reveal was far more alarming: a lethal dose of fentanyl mixed with clonazepam and oxycodone. It wasn't just an overdose, it was a fatal cocktail of sedatives, one that could only be accessed by someone with insider knowledge and clearance. Someone like Kristin Rossum. Detectives soon discovered that a vial of fentanyl had gone missing from her workplace. They found a fresh receipt from a flower shop dated the same day, proving Kristin had purchased a single red rose. The petals were no romantic accident. They were part of the performance. There was also a needle mark on Greg's body, inconsistent with anything he'd have done to himself. Investigators were now convinced Kristin had drugged her husband, staged the scene to look like a suicide, and used the very substances she worked with every day to cover it up. At trial, prosecutors painted Kristin as cold, calculating, and image-obsessed. The affair, the motive, the access, the manipulation, it all fit. In 2002, she was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, murder by poison. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Kristin Rossum is serving her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Her appeals have failed. The civil court awarded $10 million to Greg's grieving family. But no judgment, no sentence, and no payout can ever erase what happened in that apartment. A man who believed in his marriage, who tried to save it, betrayed in the worst way possible by the woman who knew exactly how to kill and almost got away with it. 2. Monica Sementilli.
I wanted her to have fun with everything, not just sexually, just everything. I murdered him because I wanted her.
Fabio Sementilli was living the American dream. A world-renowned hairstylist, he had styled some of Hollywood's biggest names and earned a reputation not just for his skill, but for his kindness. He was a proud father of 3, a loyal husband, and a man who believed deeply in lifting others up. His home in Woodland Hills, California, was a place of family, laughter, and love. But on January 23, 2017, that peaceful life ended in a way no one could have imagined. Murdered in cold blood, not by a stranger, but by betrayal from within. That afternoon, Fabio was relaxing on his back patio, enjoying the California sun and watching TV. Minutes later, he was ambushed. Stabbed 7 times and left bleeding to death, his throat was slashed, his arteries severed. It was a brutal, calculated attack, and it happened just feet from where his family gathered for dinners and celebrations. When police arrived, the crime scene looked like a home invasion gone wrong. But detectives sensed something deeper. There were no signs of forced entry. And when they checked the home's security system, they discovered the footage had been deleted. Not just erased, wiped clean, intentionally. That changed everything. Soon, the focus shifted inward toward Monica Sementilli, Fabio's wife of over 2 decades. On the surface, Monica was the picture of a devoted wife and mother. But what investigators uncovered was a double life. Monica had been having a long-term affair with a man named Robert Baker, a former adult film actor with a violent criminal past. Together, they had been planning a way out, a way to be together, free of Fabio, and $1.6 million richer. That's how much life insurance Fabio was worth, with Monica listed as the sole beneficiary. According to prosecutors, Monica left the back door open that day, knowing exactly who was coming and why. Robert Baker didn't come alone. He brought an accomplice, Christopher Austin, to help carry out the murder. After the killing, Monica played her part, calling 911, crying, claiming she had just discovered her husband's lifeless body. But the evidence kept piling up. DNA at the scene, cell phone pings, placing Baker and Austin near the house, and damning text messages between the 3 conspirators. The final blow came when Austin agreed to cooperate with authorities. He confessed to everything and told investigators that Monica was not just involved, she was the one who set it all in motion. The courtroom was stunned when Monica's own daughter took the stand and faced her mother. "You ruined our lives," she said. "You destroyed everything we had." But Monica showed little emotion. No tears, no apology, just silence. In April 2025, Monica Sementilli was found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances and conspiracy to commit murder. Her sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. She now resides at the Central California Women's Facility, the same prison that houses California's most notorious female lifers. Fabio Sementilli had spent his life creating beauty, building a family, and trusting the woman he loved. And in the end, that woman unlocked the door, not for him to walk through, but for killers to walk in. The betrayal was complete and irreversible. 3. Patricia Krenwinkel.
She was convicted in the murders of 7 people during the Manson cult's rampage through LA in the summer of 1969. The commissioner cited her low risk of offending and the fact that she was just 21 at the time of the murders. The panel.
She was once a Catholic schoolgirl from Los Angeles, shy, insecure, and searching for belonging. But in the summer of 1967, Patricia Krenwinkel met a man who would change her life and seal her fate. His name was Charles Manson. Charismatic, dangerous, and messianic in his delusions, Manson offered her what she'd never found before: attention, purpose, and a twisted version of love. Patricia followed him without question, and 2 years later, she followed him straight into one of the most infamous killing sprees in American history. On August 8, 1969, just one night after the Manson family murdered pregnant actress Sharon Tate and 4 others in a Hollywood Hills mansion, Manson sent another group out to kill again. This time, their targets were Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a quiet, middle-aged couple who owned a chain of grocery stores and lived in a modest Los Angeles home. They had nothing to do with Manson. They were picked at random, chosen only because of where they lived. That night, Patricia Krenwinkel entered the LaBianca home along with Tex Watson and Leslie Van Houten. Leno was tied up in the living room. Rosemary was dragged to the bedroom. What followed was unspeakable. Patricia stabbed Rosemary repeatedly, then used a carving fork to mutilate Leno's body, etching the word war into his stomach. On the walls, using the victim's blood, she scrawled messages intended to spark chaos and terror, just as Manson instructed. Patricia later admitted to chasing Rosemary through the house with a knife as the woman screamed for her life. At trial, Patricia showed no remorse. She smiled, sang songs with the other women, and carved an X into her forehead to match Manson. She claimed she killed for love, that Manson was her world, her god, and that she would have done anything for him. In 1971, she was sentenced to death. But 1 year later, California's Supreme Court abolished the death penalty, and Patricia's sentence was automatically commuted to life in prison. That's where she's remained ever since. More than 5 decades behind bars, longer than many of her victims ever lived. Over the years, Patricia has claimed to have changed. She earned college degrees in prison, participated in rehabilitation programs, and eventually began expressing remorse. At her parole hearings, she's called herself a coward, a follower, someone who let others think for her, and whose weakness allowed innocent people to die. But for the families of the victims, that remorse is too little, too late. They see a woman who helped butcher innocent people in their own home and then laughed about it on national television. In 2022, a parole board recommended her release. But in 2023, California Governor Gavin Newsom reversed the decision, calling her a continued threat and citing the atrociousness of her crimes. Today, Patricia Krenwinkel is still serving life without parole at the California Institution for Women in Chino. She is the longest incarcerated female inmate in the state. She may look like a grandmother now, gray-haired, soft-spoken, quiet. But for many, she will always be the woman with the knife, the one who smiled through the blood and never once tried to stop it. 4. Pearl Fernandez.
Brutal murder of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez. KCAL 9's Cara Finston has more on this breaking story from downtown.
Starving this poor child, it is unimaginable the pain that this child probably endured.
There are crimes that shock a city, others that shake a nation, and then there are crimes so cruel, so utterly inhumane, that they leave people broken, angry, and asking how it was ever allowed to happen. The case of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez was one of those. It wasn't just murder, it was prolonged, deliberate torture. And the person responsible wasn't a stranger or a monster in the dark. It was his own mother, Pearl Fernandez. Pearl lived in Palmdale, California, with her boyfriend Isauro Aguirre and her son Gabriel, a bright, kind, and curious boy who loved books, animals, and wanted to be a police officer when he grew up. But behind closed doors, his life was a nightmare. Over the course of 8 months in 2013, Gabriel was subjected to unspeakable abuse. He was beaten with a belt buckle and a bat. He was forced to eat cat litter, spoiled food, and his own vomit. He was pepper sprayed in the face, locked in a small cabinet for hours, bound and gagged, and shot with a BB gun over and over again. The torture was systematic, cold, carried out by both Pearl and her boyfriend, and it happened while Gabriel was still attending school, showing up with black eyes, bruises, bald patches, broken teeth, and open wounds. He wrote heartbreaking notes to his teacher asking for help. "Can you call someone to help me?" he once wrote. The teacher did, and so did multiple others. Family members, neighbors, school officials. Reports were filed, social workers visited, but no one stepped in. On May 22, 2013, Pearl called 911 and claimed Gabriel wasn't breathing. First responders found him unconscious, with cracked ribs, swollen limbs, a fractured skull, and burns all over his body. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was already too late. Gabriel died 2 days later. He had been tortured to death, and the state had failed to protect him. During Pearl's trial, prosecutors described her as manipulative, remorseless, and complicit in every act of brutality. She pled guilty to first-degree murder with special circumstances, murder involving torture. The judge gave her the maximum penalty, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aguirre received the death penalty. But the outrage didn't end with sentencing. The public demanded to know how social workers missed so many warning signs, how a child could beg for help repeatedly and still be sent home to die. 4 county employees were criminally charged for child welfare failures, though charges were later dismissed. Still, the case prompted widespread reforms in California's Department of Children and Family Services. Today, Pearl Fernandez is housed at the Central California Women's Facility. She has filed appeals, claiming she suffered from mental illness and intellectual disability, but the courts have upheld her sentence. To Gabriel's family and to millions who followed his case, her name will forever be a symbol of betrayal. Not just of motherhood, but of basic human decency. Because the worst part of Gabriel's story is that it could have been stopped, and she made sure it wasn't. 5. Jennifer Deleon. Jennifer Deleon was a young wife, a mother, and a community college student. She smiled easily, dressed stylishly, and lived in a quiet California suburb with her husband, Skylar Deleon, a former child actor. To the outside world, they looked like any young couple trying to make ends meet. But behind their carefully polished image was a dark secret. A desperate hunger for wealth and a willingness to kill for it. In 2004, Thomas and Jackie Hawks were enjoying their golden years, retired, deeply in love, and living their dream aboard a 55-foot yacht named Well Deserved. After years of hard work, Including Thomas's time as a probation officer, they were ready to sell the boat and settle into life as grandparents. When a young couple expressed interest in buying their yacht, the Hawks agreed to meet them at the marina in Newport Beach. That young couple was Jennifer and Skylar Deleon. What the Hawks didn't know was that Jennifer and Skylar had no real money and no intention of buying the boat. Their plan was far more sinister. With the help of two accomplices, the Deleons lured the Hawks out to sea under the guise of a test run. Once they were far enough from shore, the attack began. Thomas and Jackie were overpowered, bound with duct tape, and forced to sign over financial documents, including power of attorney. Then, in a final act of cruelty, they were tied to an anchor and thrown overboard, alive. They drowned in the Pacific Ocean, and their bodies were never found. Back on land, Jennifer played the part. She posed as a buyer, filed paperwork, and even spoke to the Hawks family to avoid suspicion. But it didn't last. Investigators quickly grew suspicious when the couple vanished without a trace. A search of the well-deserved revealed signs of foul play. Traces of blood, cleaning agents, and inconsistencies in the Deleon story cracked the case wide open. The accomplices eventually confessed and pointed the finger squarely at Jennifer and Skylar as the masterminds. At trial, prosecutors painted Jennifer as manipulative, cold, and every bit as responsible for the murders as her husband. She had helped lure the Hawks, played the role of trust builder, and stood by as the couple was executed at sea. Her defense argued that she was under Skylar's control, a manipulated wife. But the evidence told another story. She wasn't just complicit. She was central to the plan. The jury didn't hesitate. In 2006, Jennifer Deleon was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Skylar Deleon was sentenced to death and remains on California's death row at San Quentin. Their accomplices received lengthy sentences as well. Today, Jennifer Deleon is serving her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility. Her name may not be as well known as other killers, but her crime was just as haunting. She walked onto a boat smiling, knowing the couple she greeted would never return to shore. All for greed. All for a life she never earned, and now will never have. 6. Dana Sue Gray. In the spring of 1994, residents of Lake Elsinore, California, were gripped by fear. Elderly women were being found dead in their homes, strangled, stabbed, or beaten, with their credit cards missing and their bank accounts emptied. At first, investigators thought the murders might be isolated incidents. But the pattern became clear, and soon, the quiet retirement community realized a serial killer was among them. That killer turned out to be someone no one expected, a former nurse named Dana Sue Gray. Dana Gray was 39 years old, blonde, athletic, and well-dressed. To many, she looked like a fitness instructor, or someone who'd shop at Nordstrom, not someone who'd be capable of murder. But beneath her polished surface was a woman unraveling. She had recently lost her job as a nurse due to theft of drugs. She was in debt, obsessed with material things, and had developed a craving for spending that bordered on addiction. When the money ran out, she looked for a new source, and she found it in vulnerable, elderly women. Her first known victim was 86-year-old Norma Davis, found stabbed to death in her home with multiple wounds to her neck and chest. Just weeks later, 66-year-old June Roberts was found strangled in her living room, her bank card stolen and used almost immediately after her death. Surveillance footage soon captured Dana using June's credit cards to go on a shopping spree, buying perfume, clothes, and luxury items as if nothing had happened. The killings didn't stop there. In the span of just a few weeks, Dana murdered 2 more women, 87-year-old Dora Beebe and 57-year-old Dorothy Harris. Both were found beaten or strangled with their financial accounts quickly drained after death. The brutality of the attacks contrasted sharply with Dana's demeanor. She wasn't driven by rage or revenge. She killed to fund a lifestyle: manicures, designer outfits, fine dining. In one case, she stopped to get her nails done, right after a murder, using the victim's stolen card. Her downfall came when a surviving victim, who managed to escape a similar attack, identified Dana as the woman who had offered her a ride and then assaulted her in her own home. That tip combined with surveillance footage and Dana's financial records, gave police everything they needed. She was arrested in March 1994. At trial, Dana's defense team considered an insanity plea, but ultimately opted for a deal. To avoid the death penalty, Dana Gray pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, she is serving that sentence at the Central California Women's Facility. In interviews, Dana has never shown deep remorse. She has described the murders as if they were impulsive and driven by desperation, but the facts show a clear, calculated pattern. Her story became a disturbing example of what happens when greed, narcissism, and a complete disregard for human life spiral out of control. Dana Sue Gray didn't kill for passion or revenge. She killed for shopping bags and left behind a trail of death in the name of vanity. Rib 7. Larissa Schuster. When Larissa Schuster married Timothy Schuster, they seemed like the perfect Central Valley couple. Larissa was a successful biochemist. Tim, a soft-spoken medical technician. They had a son, a nice home in Clovis, California, and what looked like a quiet, stable life. But behind that facade was a marriage growing increasingly toxic, and eventually, fatally so. Larissa had grown resentful, controlling, and obsessed with power. When divorce proceedings began, she didn't just want Tim out of her life, she wanted him erased. It started with arguments, custody battles, and control over property. But in 2003, Larissa took a step that stunned even the most hardened detectives. Along with her lab assistant and accomplice, James Fagone, Larissa hatched a plan to kidnap and kill her husband, using the very chemicals she worked with every day. On the morning of July 10, 2003, Tim Schuster disappeared. His family reported him missing, but they had no idea the horror he had already endured. He had been ambushed, drugged, beaten, unconscious, and stuffed into a barrel in a storage facility rented by Larissa herself. And inside that barrel was a deadly bath, nitric acid, slowly dissolving his body as he lay helpless, still breathing. The details of the murder were almost too horrific to believe. Evidence later showed that Tim may have been alive for hours after being placed in the barrel. Larissa returned to the storage unit multiple times, adjusting the temperature, checking the progress, and waiting for the acid to finish its work. It was methodical, clinical, completely devoid of emotion. By the time authorities discovered the barrel, Tim's remains were unrecognizable. But surrounding him were clues, chemical containers traced back to Larissa's lab, receipts, surveillance footage, and witnesses who placed her at the scene. Investigators quickly connected the dots. Larissa had motive, means, and opportunity. She wanted full control of their assets. She didn't want to split anything in the divorce, and more than anything, she wanted to inflict maximum suffering. During the trial, prosecutors painted her as ice-cold and power-hungry. They described the murder as a science experiment gone monstrous. A woman who used her professional knowledge not to save lives, but to destroy one in the most agonizing way possible. Larissa showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. No remorse, no apology, no regret. Her accomplice, James Fagone, testified against her in exchange for a lesser sentence. He admitted to helping with the kidnapping, but made it clear that Larissa was the mastermind and the one who insisted on using acid. She wanted control down to the final moment. In 2008, Larissa Schuster was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is currently housed at the Central California Women's Facility. To this day, her case is cited as one of the most chilling in California history, not just for the brutality, but for the disturbing precision. Larissa Schuster didn't lose control. She planned every moment, every step, every chemical reaction. And in doing so, she became known across the country by a name no one ever forgets: the acid bath killer. 8. Helen Golay. Helen Golay was wealthy, elegant, and well into her 70s. She lived in Santa Monica, drove a luxury car, and carried herself like someone who had figured life out. But behind the pearls and polite smiles was a predator, one who used charm, opportunity, and paperwork to kill. She didn't use a gun or a knife. Her weapon was manipulation. Her targets were homeless men, and her motive was simple: money. Together with her accomplice, Olga Ruderschmidt, Helen Golay, masterminded one of the most cold-blooded and financially motivated murder plots in modern California history. The two elderly women cruised the streets of Los Angeles pretending to be good Samaritans. They offered food, shelter, and help to vulnerable homeless men, most of them in poor health, mentally fragile, and completely alone. But what these men didn't know was that while they were being cared for, Helen and Olga were taking out life insurance policies on them, dozens of them, listing themselves as beneficiaries and forging signatures and addresses to make the paperwork appear legitimate. The scam lasted years. Between 1997 and 2005, Helen and Olga took out more than $2.8 million in policies. But some of those men didn't live long enough to see their supposed new start. In 1999, Paul Vados was found dead in a Hollywood alley, apparently hit by a car in a tragic accident. Then in 2005, Kenneth McDavid, another homeless man under their care, was also found dead in an eerily similar hit-and-run scenario. The two women collected nearly $2.5 million between those two deaths alone. What raised suspicion wasn't just the repeat pattern. It was the sheer volume of policies. Insurance investigators began to wonder why two elderly women had insured so many unrelated men, and why those men kept dying under strange circumstances. A deeper investigation revealed forged documents, fake addresses, and conflicting statements. Surveillance footage later captured Helen and Olga following one of the victims shortly before his death. Police also uncovered a shocking audio recording, a conversation between the two women, secretly taped by investigators, discussing the insurance scams and even mocking one of their victims. During the trial, Helen Golay showed little remorse. She denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forged paperwork, the money trail, and the recorded conversations sealed her fate. Prosecutors called it one of the most disturbing financial murder plots they'd ever seen. Not driven by desperation, but by calculated greed. These weren't women who killed in the heat of passion. They killed quietly, methodically, with contracts, not weapons. In 2008, Helen Golay was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of fraud. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her accomplice, Olga Rutterschmidt, received the same sentence and died in prison in 2021. Today, Helen Golay remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. She is one of the oldest women serving life without parole in the state. Her name is rarely mentioned now, but her legacy is unforgettable. A chilling reminder that not all killers look like monsters. Some wear perfume, some write checks, and some simply smile as they plan your death. 9. Susan Eubanks. On the night of October 26, 1997, police officers in San Marcos, California, responded to a 911 call that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside a quiet suburban home, they found 4 boys, ages 4, 6, 7, and 14, shot execution style, each one in their bedroom, tucked under blankets. The shooter wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a home invader. It was their own mother, Susan Eubanks. Eubanks had no prior criminal record. She had worked as a hairdresser, attended parenting classes, and outwardly presented herself as a struggling but involved mother. But beneath the surface was a storm of rage, resentment, and unraveling control. She was battling alcoholism, financial stress, and a bitter custody battle with her ex-husband and the fathers of her children. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Susan's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Friends and family noticed her anger building. There were fights, accusations, threats, and on that night, it all exploded. Susan had been drinking heavily. She got into a violent argument with her boyfriend, who left the house. In a fit of rage, she disabled the home's phone lines, grabbed a .38 caliber revolver, and walked into each of her son's bedrooms. She shot 14-year-old Brandon first, then 7-year-old Austin, then 6-year-old Brigham, and finally, 4-year-old Matthew. Each of them was shot in the head at close range. She then turned the gun on herself and attempted suicide, but the wound wasn't fatal. She survived, and would later have to live through the trial of explaining why. During the investigation, prosecutors revealed Susan had made comments about taking the kids with her and not letting the fathers win. Her motive, they argued, wasn't insanity or mental illness. It was revenge. A final act of control meant to punish the men who had left her. The case horrified the nation. People couldn't comprehend how a mother, the one person meant to protect her children above all else, could become their killer. At trial, her defense team argued that Susan was mentally ill, depressed, and in a blackout state due to alcohol. But jurors weren't convinced. The evidence showed planning. She had removed the phone lines, she had written suicide notes, she had left her oldest son alive long enough to watch his brothers die. The level of cruelty was undeniable. In 1999, Susan Eubanks was sentenced to death, making her one of the very few women on California's death row. But in 2024, her sentence was commuted to life without the possibility of parole, after the state re-evaluated dozens of death sentences involving mental health claims and procedural issues. Today, she is serving that sentence at the Central California Women's Facility. She rarely speaks publicly and has never shown remorse. There are no graves for her sons. All 4 were cremated, their ashes scattered in private. No headlines can fully capture the magnitude of what she took that night. Susan Eubanks didn't just destroy her family, she annihilated it. And in doing so, she became one of the darkest symbols of maternal betrayal the state of California has ever seen. 10. Nancy Garrido.
So you were supposed to sit down next to them, play nice, sound interested, and somehow coax them into moving around and so they could be videotaped.
It was June 10th, 1991, when 11-year-old J.C. Lee Dugard disappeared while walking to her school bus stop in South Lake Tahoe, California. In a matter of seconds, a car pulled up and she was taken. What followed became one of the most shocking and heartbreaking missing persons cases in American history. Not just because she vanished, but because of how long she remained hidden. 18 years passed before anyone saw her again. And at the center of it all was a woman named Nancy Garrido. Nancy, along with her husband Philip Garrido, carried out a kidnapping that would remain unsolved for nearly 2 decades. While Philip was a known offender with a troubling criminal past, it was Nancy's role that stunned many. She was not a passive bystander. In fact, she played a critical role in both the abduction and the concealment. It was Nancy who helped lure JC that morning. And Nancy, who helped maintain the illusion of normalcy to the outside world, while the truth remained buried behind fences and locked gates. The Garridos kept JC in a concealed area behind their Antioch, California home. There, they isolated her from the world and made her live under strict control and supervision. Nancy's role was complex. She alternated between strict overseer and at times a figure of false comfort, all while continuing to hide the truth. Over the years, JC became a mother to 2 daughters born during her captivity. Nancy helped raise them, not as an outsider, but as a central part of the life JC was forced to live. Despite the appearance of a makeshift family, the situation was anything but normal. There was no freedom. JC had no access to the outside world, no school, no contact with her loved ones. For nearly 20 years, her real name was erased, and the life she once knew became a distant memory. All the while, Nancy Garrido helped manage the logistics, cover up the reality, and maintain the lies that kept JC from being found. Everything changed in 2009, when Philip brought JC's 2 daughters with him to a college campus and attracted the attention of campus security. Their concern led to a series of events that unraveled the entire story. JC, by then 29 years old, finally told authorities who she was. The case broke wide open, and with it, the role of Nancy Garrido was fully exposed. In 2011, Nancy pled guilty to kidnapping and assisting in long-term concealment, avoiding a lengthy trial. She was sentenced to 36 years to life in prison and is currently incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Her husband, Philip, received a much longer sentence and remains in prison. Nancy Garrido's involvement continues to disturb many. She didn't just help take a child, she helped build a world where that child was never supposed to be found. Some called her the silent partner. Others called her something worse. But one thing remains true. Without her help, this case may have ended very differently, or far sooner. And for those who followed JC's story, Nancy's role will never be forgotten. They once lived in cities lined with palm trees and ocean air. They had husbands, children, careers, and communities that trusted them. Some were educated, Some were admired, others were simply invisible, until the day their names filled courtroom dockets and newspaper headlines. Today, they all wear the same color. They eat behind bars, sleep behind locks, and count their days and years, knowing those years may never end. These women were sentenced by a judge, but their true sentence is something much deeper, one of memory, of legacy, of what can never be undone. Each case you've just heard is real, verified, documented. These aren't just stories, they are the final chapters of lives destroyed by greed, rage, control, and betrayal. A toxicologist who used her scientific training to carry out a silent, staged killing. A wife who unlocked the door to let her husband's murderers in. A young mother who murdered her children because she couldn't bear to lose custody. A nurse who took lives to fund shopping trips. And others who targeted the vulnerable with patience, planning, and cold precision. Not in a moment of madness, but in deliberate silence. And yet, their crimes aren't the only part of the story. There are victims whose voices were silenced, and families whose grief never ends. There are children who grew up with no parents, and parents who buried their own children. There are survivors, like J.C. Dugard, who showed us that the human spirit can endure even the unimaginable. Their pain didn't end in a courtroom. It continues in ways the rest of the world may never fully see. The Central California Women's Facility now houses many of the women you've heard about. It's a place with no parole boards for most of them. No second chances, just long, slow time. But for those on the outside, for us, the sentence is different. It's the responsibility to remember what happened, not to sensationalize it, but to witness it, to understand how choices unravel lives, how control, resentment, and greed can turn into violence, how trust, the most human thing we have, can be shattered in the worst possible ways. So what should we take from this? Maybe it's the reminder that darkness doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it blends in, and sometimes it lives right next door. If these stories stayed with you, share them. Not because they're shocking, but because they're real. Because remembering is the least we can do for the victims, for the families, and for the truth that still echoes long after the headlines fade. This was 10 California women serving life in prison. Stories you won't forget. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay informed, and never forget what justice sometimes has to carry when lives are taken and sentences never truly end. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Like this video if you learned something new. Subscribe for more true crime stories.